For those of you that I haven't met, I'm Gabe Lerner, the publisher of Democracy Notes. You can think of Democracy Notes as part trade publication, part field building initiative. We serve an audience of 11,000 democracy funders, practitioners, job seekers, all of whom are working on or hoping to work on US democracy in their day jobs. And folks generally come to us for our curation to help them stay up to speed on what's happening in democracy philanthropy, to know who's hiring, to stay up to speed on trends in the field. And many of you also come to us for events like these, which ideally help you think differently about your work or spotlight an emerging trend that you should be aware of. So I'm going to dive into the purpose of this event and then talk through the agenda before turning things over to Kelly. The purpose of this event is a bit of a strange one. It's a bit of a quirky one. It's to instill a particular state of mind in each of you, at least for a few minutes. So to provide some context there, I had a really powerful experience when reading Gideon's recent piece, and had that same experience when watching a video of Gideon's talk at a recent funder convening run by PACE, Philanthropy for Active Civic Engagement. And it was the first time in a really long time that I got into this creative, exploratory, generative state of mind. And so I was immediately eager to bring that experience to you. And I'm thrilled to be joined today by Kelly Bourne, who's inaugural director of the Democracy, Rights, and Governance Initiative at the David and Lucille Packard Foundation, and by Gideon Lichfield, former editor-in-chief of Wired and the MIT Technology Review, and the author of the Futurepolis Substack. So we are going to uh, chat through a couple of things over the next hour. I'm going to turn things over to Kelly to talk about the origin and purpose of the Democracy Futures Project and what that effort has looked like to date. And then Gideon is going to walk us through this narrative fiction, this design fiction, this story about what our democracy might look like in 2040. And then the three of us will have a little bit of chatting and debriefing of the scenario, and then we'll open it up to all of you for your questions, for Gideon, for Kelly, reactions to the scenario. Please feel free to use the chat to share questions, whether that's in the Q&A part of the agenda or before. And without further ado, Kelly, over to you.
Thanks, Gabe. Really glad to be here. Nice to see all of you. I'll share quickly a couple slides as I think it makes the project a little more uh, relatable. Can everybody see this? Great. So this project started about a year and a half ago, and the program was in partnership with PACE. So Kristen and I have been kind of interested. But basically, the goal was to bring US democracy funders together to support longer term sort of positive visioning for the field and to get folks more comfortable and familiar with kind of futuring and foresight capabilities. And so ultimately, we ended up convening about 80, maybe a few more democracy funders, mostly in the US and some in Europe. Um, when I talk about futuring or foresight, what we basically mean is the kind of practice that has been used.
Oh, Kelly, you went on mute.
Not totally sure how, since I didn't touch anything, but it's a process that we've used mostly in the private sector and government to imagine stories about what the future might look like, how the world might turn out in 10, 20, 30 years, and then use those stories and imaginations to help us adapt our current strategies to a pretty rapidly changing world. And so I'll share, actually, first, let me share a couple other things about the project with Pace. So I had done this work, just to give some context of how I got into it. I had done this work maybe 20 years ago as a strategy consultant, mostly to companies in aerospace and biotech, but also to governments, including the US intelligence community, these kinds of projects started, maybe 50 years ago and came out of Royal Dutch Shell after the sort of oil crises, but had been used in South Africa after apartheid and in many other places to try and imagine how to prepare for the future. And so I had been in the democracy field back in 2012, I had started and then left for a bit. And when I came back in 2023, was really struck by how much the field had changed. Many more funders, a lot more nonprofits as well. And the field had become, I think, much more sort of short-term and reactive and defensive and kind of election cycle oriented in many good ways. And a lot of that work has been really, really essential. But there just wasn't very much space for sort of long-term positive creative visioning. And so that was really the impetus for this project and why I had reached out to Kristen was to try and think about how we could instill more of that capacity in the field. And so there are a bunch of different ways that you can do futuring work. We used a number of different methodologies here, but one that resonated, I think, a lot with folks, so I thought I could quickly speak to it, was the Three Horizons framework. And the argument with this is basically that most people tend to default to, or most strategies tend to orient around one of these three horizons of thinking. And the horizons one tends to be the work around supporting the current system, which usually is performing well initially, and then over time starts to decline, either due to changes in the external environment or some kind of inherent limitations in the system itself. And then you have other folks who tend to operate in a kind of Horizon 2 mindset. So they support emerging innovations, often bridging the gap between the current system and future goals. Some of them tend to prop up or prolong the lifespan of the current system, and then others tend to sort of help pave the way to a Horizon 3. And then the Horizon 3 folks or strategies tend to be more around fundamentally transforming a system to try and better align it with the current environment. And so I think when we started this project, I was observing that there was much more of a weight on the Horizon 1 and some Horizon 2 thinking in the democracy field, and just less space for the more creative, longer term work. And the concern was that just so much is changing in the external world that if we didn't help sort of provide support for the field to shift into more of a Horizon 2 or Horizon 3 space, that we could kind of defend the current system, but it wasn't going to address the legitimate concerns that are undermining democracy or get us into kind of a longer term space. And so what did we do? Kristen and I and a few others, we reached out to some of the folks that I used to work with in the futuring space with the Intel community. We hosted 3 convenings over the last year or so. The first one in DC was like focused on horizon scanning. What are all the things changing in the world that have nothing to do with democracy but are going to impact us? The second, then we kind of mashed those up when we met in Arizona and said, how might all of these changes collide to create some pretty different futures? And then when we met again earlier this month, when Gideon joined us, it was much more sort of inside out thinking of what's changing within democracy and how can we sort of create positive future visions for how it might evolve. So I'll spend just a second on each of those. So what we normally do as funders and nonprofits in the space is we think about our own strategies. Most of those pertain to, we're changing voting systems or government processes, right? But we spend less time thinking about all the things happening in the world around us that are going to impact democracy. And so we often, in the futuring space, use what's called a STEEP framework: social, technological, economic, environmental, and political. So on the social side, we talked a lot about declining U.S. birth rates and the big shift in the age of the U.S. population and what that sort of silver tsunami might mean for democracy. On the tech side, we talked about AI. On the environment side, we talked about climate migration and rising food prices and how that might impact democracy. And then when we met again in the second convening in Arizona, we mashed up all of those different 9 things that we had been talking about and thought about what kind of worlds might this create. So we had a network state that was, tech goes unregulated, oligarchs collude with government, and we're living in a real surveillance state. We had a positive tech vision, which is closer to what I think Gideon will talk about, that was tech goes really well and enables a lot of civic innovation. We had one around democracy rising that was in the face of climate change, people come together rather than sort of fragment. And then we had a divided nation where the culture wars end up creating basically three different sort of divided countries. And then I think the last one I'll say is that then we met again in June, and then we did more of that inside out thinking of what are all of the innovations happening in democracy, citizen assemblies, AI civic agents, and how might we build on some of these innovations to get us into a much better place. And we brought there, in addition to Gideon, we had Sophie Howe, who was the world's first future commissioner from Wales, come and talk about now the UN and many other places are thinking about how do we better represent the interests of future generations. And so that was the project. And we have one more convening in September that Kristen and I are working on now. And then she's really helpfully pulled together a bunch of resources, both from PACE and Democracy Funders Network, as well, has pulled together some futuring resources. So I'll stop there. I'll turn it over to Gideon, but that was, a quick cook's tour of what we've been up to in this space.
And Gideon, before you go, uh, Kristen, is there anything else that you'd like to share from the pace side? I know it's 7 a.m. in New Zealand, bright and early.
It is. It is. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon to you. Good morning to me. I think Kelly did a great job talking about where we've been, what we've been doing, and why we've been doing it. I think the thing that I would emphasize from Pace's perspective is really the learning and the collective learning journey that we have been on together. And that it's not about, in any of these scenarios, it's not about an either or. It's not about we need all of our money in Horizon 3 or, we need to move away from Horizon 1. It's not about deprioritizing the present in order to prioritize the future. It's about thinking about the balance that should exist between these things and how even if our work to do is in one space, like maybe we are Horizon 2 funders, it still benefits us to know what's happening in Horizon 1 and Horizon 3. And if we are working in the present, we still need to be thinking about the long term and the potential unintended consequences or intended consequences for that matter. And so what we've really been doing, it's again, it's not about having a right or wrong or one or the other or do this, not that. It's really about building our muscle and our skills and capacity to think differently about what might happen in the future and what that might mean for us. And then being able to hold up our strategies and say, okay, if these things start happening and we know what signals to look for about what's happening, what might that mean for us? Is our strategy sufficient? And if no, how might we modify that in order to be ready for that potential future state? And if it is, great. And then what can we do to either hasten the best things that could happen about the future and make them more likely to happen, or to mitigate the worst consequences of a potential dystopian or unideal future state. So again, just really want to reinforce the skill building and that it's about helping everybody figure out what their role is in the future and how to think differently. Because I think one of our biggest takeaways is thinking about the future is not necessarily about brainstorming. It's about imagination. And those are really different parts of our brain that we're not always tuned into and we don't always know how to use. So thanks for the opportunity to jump in real quick.
I love
And
that.
Kelly did a great job.
I was also really struggling in trying to describe the impact that Gideon's talk, which I'll give in a moment, had on me. And it really was that distinction between imagination and brainstorming. Like it got me into an imagination headspace, not just a brainstorming headspace. So that is a perfect tee up. Gideon, over to you to talk us through the scenario.
Thank you. Well, I feel like I've been talked up so much now. I have to give the most amazing performance, or they'll be really disappointed. Anyway, I will very briefly say how I got to this talk that I'm giving. For years as a journalist, I was interested in the problem of, basically why is democracy going so wrong and how do we fix it? And I started to become aware of what I would not even call a community, but like a very loose collection of people around the world who are all working on different facets of what it would look like to invent democracy today. How would we build the institutions in the forms of civic participation and the government processes and the community building and the media environment and all of those different things that in one way or another are aspects of how you govern societies? And how would we do it for the 21st century in ways that match the pace of change and the technologies and everything that we have today, um, rather than the systems we have, which were really built in an extremely different world, might as well have been a different planet. So as I got to know more and more of these people and these efforts that are taking place around the world, I started to try to think, how would it look like if you piece all this together? And so that is what I am going to talk about. I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. All right, hopefully you can all see that. So, I gave this talk at the Democracy Futures gathering that Kristen and Kelly held 2 or 3 weeks ago. And one of the things that I started with, well, the thing I started was this slide, which is just reflects how low an opinion Americans in particular have of American democracy. And it's obviously not just Trump voters. It is people across the board really don't think that American democracy is a good example to the rest of the world. But in a lot of other established democracies as well, people are just not particularly satisfied with the way democracy is working. And I think that people who work on democracy, people in profits and foundations and so on, and the media, of course, we often talk about the importance of democratic values and institutions and checks and balances and the rule of law and all of these things that are inherent to democracy. And I sometimes think we assume too hard that the general public cares about those things in themselves. I think it's generally believed that having those democratic values and having democratic institutions, it's supposed to lead to better outcomes, to better government than you would get from an autocracy. And I think we, in a group like this, take that for granted. And I think maybe what we've lost sight of is the fact that not everybody does take that for granted anymore. And so I think people ask themselves, what is the point of democracy? And at that funders, I'm not going to repeat the exercise now, but at that funders meeting, I threw open the question to the room, what is the point of democracy? And I actually got a very kind of dispersed set of answers. I didn't get like one clear response. And I think that is, again, because people think of democracy as being about institutions, elections, civic participation, rule of law, whatever these things are. But I think all of those are merely means to an end. And the end is to deliver government that serves people better than other systems can. And if democracy can't achieve that, then I think that it has no point, or to many people at least, it has no point. And so what I started to think about was how would you pull together all of these democratic innovations that are already happening all around the world to produce government that serves people better than other systems can. And so the scenario I'm going to talk you through is just one attempt to imagine how some, not all, but some of these innovations do come together. So I'm going to take you to the year 2040. I'm going to ask you to meet Sandra. And Sandra is a new mother in her early 30s. She lives in a small city in Michigan. And she has this routine now where she gets up in the morning, she feeds her new kid, and then she sits down in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, and she listens to a 5-minute news podcast that is delivered by her AI assistant, Harry. And he's called Harry because Prince Harry in 2040 has had a midlife crisis. He's become a punk rock band musician, and Sandra's a huge fan of his. So Harry is her personal assistant, and he reads her news podcast. The podcast is personalized to her based on her preferences, and Harry knows her preferences because he has access to her social media feeds, what she browses online, her email, basically every bit of digital information about her. And she is comfortable giving him this information because there are now in 2040 strong privacy laws that mean that her data can't be used for purposes that she doesn't consent to. In fact, even the AI company that makes Harry isn't allowed to use Sandra's data for further training of its models. Everything is self-contained to her own particular use. So anyway, Sandra listens to her news podcast, and in it there's there's an item about flooding in Florida because that's where her mother lives. And there is an item about state taxes in Michigan, which is where she lives. There's some new science about nutrition for toddlers, which obviously is interesting to her because she has a new kid. And then there is this item that makes her perk up and pay attention because it turns out that the House of Representatives is considering a bill. And this bill would allow AI psychotherapists to be licensed on a par with human ones to deliver psychotherapy according to all the same rules as human therapists. And so when Sandra listens to this, she perks up because she has a friend who is, she's known since they were at school together. And this friend of hers, Paul, has always had struggles with mental health, but he comes from a poor background. He's never been able to afford decent therapy. And so she thinks it would be really good if someone like Paul could get access to good quality AI psychotherapy that would cost him less. So she asks Harry to go deeper on this news item. She says, I want to know more about this. And so Harry expands on the news he's just read her, and he tells her about how the legislation came up in Congress, the fact that the medical profession is against licensing AI therapists, probably not surprisingly. Patient advocacy groups are in favor of it. The insurance industry is split. So Harry tells her all about this. And then he says, so Sandra, what do you think about AI psychotherapy? And Sandra thinks for a second, and she says, well, it would be really good if someone like Paul could get affordable therapy. But I guess I'm worried that maybe these AI therapists would just not be very well programmed, or they would make errors that nobody would catch. So I would want to know what the safeguards are against things going wrong. And Harry says, okay, would you like me to send that feedback to Congress? Sandra says, yes, you can send it. So what will happen over the next 30 days is that Congress will get approximately 4 million pieces of feedback on the AI psychotherapy bill. And a lot of those will come through people talking to AI assistants like Harry that give them the news and then solicit their opinion. Some of it will be people, posting things on social media because they've heard about the bill. Some of them might even write letters into Congress in the traditional way. The Congressional Research Service processes all of this data. It crunches it. It filters out and finds that there are roughly half a dozen broad groups of opinion about licensing AI psychotherapy. It summarizes all the data from those groups of opinion, and it codes them into these AI avatars, these digital humans that you can talk to. And each avatar can represent the arguments for its particular kind of opinion group, but it can also tell stories, anecdotes from individual people who wrote in. And so politicians can talk to these avatars as a way of understanding public opinion better. And they can quiz them and get to know public opinion in a way that they would never be able to do from mere opinion polls. And members of the public can talk to these avatars as well. They're publicly available. And it turns out that people really enjoy talking to them because they're created to be engaging and funny, and they have lots of interesting stories. And so it's a way for both politicians and the public to get to grips with an issue that is divisive and understand differing points of view. And so this is now part of the process by which legislation is considered, public comment is sought, and then politicians can use that to deliberate on what actions to take. So Harry finishes the newscast, and now he moves on to some admin stuff. And he says to Sandra, your tax return is ready. So in 2040, the Internal Revenue Service creates your tax return for you. You don't need to file it. It generates it based on your W-9s, your W-2s, your 1099s, all your forms. It also has access to your bank accounts. And it can simply say to you, this is what we think you should pay in taxes. And if you trust it, you can simply hit yes, and it will file your taxes. And if not, you can go and review the return on your own. Now, the IRS also has access to hospital records. So it knows that Sandra had a kid in the last year. And so it has automatically added the child tax credit. So all she needs to do, if she wants, is she can review the form. And Harry asks her, do you want to review your taxes? But she says, no, you know what? I'm too busy. I reviewed them in past years. It was fine. Just file my tax return for me. So Harry files her tax return. The next thing he asked is if she would like to hear what's been on the community message boards. So her local town has lots and lots of active message boards, huge amount of stuff, people talking about things, way too much for one person to follow. But Harry hopefully summarizes for her every morning what the main topics of discussion have been for the last day. And so, some people are talking about renaming a local park, and some people are talking about a playground, and some people are talking about trash. And there's nothing there in particular that interests Andrea. If she wanted to, she could go deeper. But in this case, she says to Harry, let's just move on. The next thing that comes up is that there is a zoning ordinance, a new zoning ordinance in the city, and there is going to be a vote on it. And so Harry says to Sandra, okay, this ordinance is coming up, and it would change the rules for small business zoning in these ways. How do you want to vote? Now, Sandra has never particularly followed zoning very closely, and she doesn't have a strong opinion on it. And she says to Harry, I don't know, like, I'm not really sure how to vote on this. So Harry says, well, your friend Carmen, she has offered herself to be a proxy on the zoning question. Would you like to delegate your vote to her? So what's happening in this case is something called liquid democracy. If you have a vote on something, but you are not sure how to vote, but there is someone whose opinion you trust, you can delegate your vote to them and they can exercise the vote on your behalf. And Carmen is offering to be a proxy for that. And Sandra knows that Carmen really, really cares about zoning. She goes to all the town hall meetings about it. She talks about zoning every chance she gets. Carmen is the zoning queen. And so Sandra says, all right, if Carmen is offering herself as a proxy, I'm going to let her take this vote. And Harry says, okay, Carmen has your vote. The final issue that comes up is a problem that Sandra really does care about, and this is trash. So for one reason or another, trash has been a problem in the city center for years. And there have been Republican mayors, there have been Democratic mayors, there's been an independent mayor. Somehow nobody's been able to clean up the trash. And it got so bad that a couple of years ago, the city convened a citizen panel, also called a citizens assembly. And this was a group of people who were brought together for a couple of weekends. They listened to expert testimony. They were led in a deliberative process to reach a consensus. And they came up with potential solutions to the trash problem. Now, some of these ideas were, pretty sensible, like install more trash bins or increase trash collection more often. Although then the question came, well, how are we going to pay for the extra trash collection? So somebody proposed taxing retailers who sell things in plastic packaging. And then somebody else said, well, what if we just make high schoolers spend several hours of community service each year picking up the trash? And somebody else said, well, what if we use the traffic cameras at intersections to monitor people who are dropping trash in the street and face recognize them and then fine them? So there were lots of crazy ideas going around. There was some deliberation. Eventually, consensus was reached. This consensus was sent to the city council, which had agreed in advance that it was going to listen to these recommendations and take them seriously. The city council deliberated. It passed an ordinance based on the recommendations. And that rule has been in place for a year. And now it is time for it to be reviewed, because one of the other things that Sandra City does is that every law or every new ordinance that is passed has outcomes attached to it. In other words, the trash law said trash in the city center had to be reduced by a certain amount for the law to be considered successful. And the law has to be reviewed after a certain period of time. And if it's reviewed and it has not achieved its goals, it has to be revised. And if it isn't revised, it automatically lapses. So this is a whole series of processes that laws undergo in order to make sure that they're being effective. And so it is time for the review. And Harry says to Sandra, well, what do you think? Is there less trash in the city? Has the problem improved? And Sandra says, no, it absolutely has not improved. The trash problem is worse than ever. I'm picking things up every day. And Harry says, okay, do you want to send that feedback to the city? And Sandra says, yes, please. So just as he did with the law on the AI psychotherapy bill, Harry sends Sandra's feedback to her city council, which it will now have to consider as it revises the trash policy. So in this period of time, it's taken 6 minutes for Harry to deliver her the news. She's filed her taxes, and she has performed no less than 3 acts of civic participation. And the whole thing has taken her roughly 10 minutes, and she can get on with her day. So this is a speculative scenario, obviously, but it involves a whole bunch of innovations that already mostly exist to some degree in some parts of the world. So just to run through them briefly, like the data privacy laws, actually, there is a data privacy law in the EU. I think it's debatable how well it works. But that would be a thing that might help people trust personalized news sources. Then again, maybe they don't even need data privacy laws because Amazon is already releasing a news bot through its smart speakers that will deliver personalized news to you based on your interests, very much like Harry. Now, this Amazon bot is not yet interactive. You can't ask it to stop and go deeper on a news item. But someday, before too long, that will probably be possible. Another thing that Amazon bot does not do right now is allow you to offer feedback. But that too is something that, again, is not technologically that difficult. Whether the problem would be here for Congress to adopt the kinds of procedures that would allow people to deliver input through an AI bot. But this, these are problems of structure and procedure, not so much of technology. The idea of these AI avatars that can summarize what a section of the public thinks and that you could talk to. There is actually a very primitive version of that already in Japan, where a guy who was running for the governorate of Tokyo created an AI avatar that sat on YouTube and that people could interact with and ask questions about his policies, about his platform. And so that, again, the basics of that technology already exists. Having the government file your taxes for you sounds horrifying to Americans. The idea that the government could have access to your bank accounts and all of these other things. But there are several countries like Estonia and New Zealand and several European countries that already do this or do it to some extent. A lot of issues here around trust of the government and security of data. But again, the process is in principle entirely possible, and it could save people a huge amount of time and make their experience of interacting with government that much better. Similarly, with automated access to benefits. The idea of community boards, I mean, we have many, many online community boards already. We have Facebook groups, we have Nextdoor. Often these are really difficult to navigate. They're very fragmented, but there are efforts going on to try to create versions that are better, that are more designed to create ties between community. And it would be a fairly trivial thing to use an AI bot like Harry to help you summarize what's going on them, dig down on the things that you care about. Liquid democracy is a thing that has been used, although in very limited settings. Interestingly, mostly in crypto communities. It has problems. Yeah, it is difficult to make it work in a way that's trustworthy, but there is also some potential there. Citizen juries and assemblies are something that are actually very widespread in a great many countries. Less so in the US, but they're starting to happen here as well. And legislative review, figuring out how laws are effective, are working, and whether or not they need to be revised. That is something that also is starting to take place in a few places. Again, not so much in the US. So my main point is that, as I said, this is a speculative scenario I drew up, but it contains a lot of things that already in some form or another exist or are being created. So how we get there isn't, I know that we're short on time, so I'm not going to talk about how we get there, except to note that some of these things are already, as I said, existed in early form. Some are going to take longer. I think the main point to make here is that the US being the federal system it is, I think the innovation that we're going to see in democracy is starting at the local and state level. We're not going to see a lot of change at the federal level in the near future. That's obvious. But because this is such a large country and because there is so much going on in different parts of it, I think there are opportunities for some of this innovation to come up at the grassroots and take hold in different places. And I think focusing attention and effort on those local efforts is where we can find some hope. So that is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gideon. That was fantastic. Gideon, I'm curious, what, if anything, you left out from this scenario? Were there any sort of margin calls or margin cases?
When you say margin cases, you mean what?
Something that you considered including in the scenario or including in sort of the policy menu at the end, but decided for one reason or another to not include.
I mean, there are a few things that I did not have, like I couldn't shoehorn all of them into the scenario. So, like one of the obvious ones is participatory budgeting, which is a thing that has been used, across a bunch of places in the US. Was first pioneered in Brazil, and it's the idea that a city gives, allocates some usually very small part of its budget to citizens to spend. Seattle is about to now start implementing a participatory budgeting plan that it adopted after the protests in 2020 against police brutality, where the community pushed for some money to be set aside so that it could set priorities on how to deal with things like public safety and mental health. So, that is an example of one thing that I think is already relatively widespread, although, as I said, it tends to be small amounts. What else? What else did I not include? I think there are, I think there's a lot of work on how to deal with misinformation. There's a lot of work on how to make create social media platforms that don't drive polarization, but instead drive or can help overcome polarization or drive connections in community. Obviously, there are problems with how to get those, how those platforms can crowd out very established big platforms with big business models. But there is work going on in that kind of area. So I know I think that there are a lot of things that I could have included that I did not. But in the effort to create one story, I was making some choices about what to put in.
I trust your artistic license there. Kelly, I'd love to bring you in. And one thing that we did not mention in your background, you were previously the director of the Cyber Initiative at the Hewlett Foundation, and also previously director of Stanford Cyber Policy Center. I'm curious to get your reaction to this scenario sort of through that tech and democracy angle, and would also love if you have other things that popped into your mind during that discussion.
Yeah, I think the primary things I would say is that, as Gideon noted, a lot of these things are really quite possible right now. The technology is there. I think the two challenges are one, that we often run into, even with citizen assemblies and things like that don't necessarily have to have a big tech component, is just the political will to adopt the recommendations that come out of these. And so I think that's the thing that we're grappling with the most, is that you can do citizen assemblies. We've been in conversations, Audrey Tang in Taiwan, Gavin Newsom, like there's a whole thing in California to do them in an AI-enabled way in the aftermath of the fires. And that's an instance where you've got some government buy-in, but in the absence of that, it becomes quite challenging. So I think that's one piece. The other part I would mention is just and Gideon touched on this as well, are the really legitimate data privacy concerns as you're seeing government adoption of technologies. And so, one of the scenarios that I mentioned, there was the Civic, and we had two scenarios that were heavy tech scenarios. One was civic innovation, which aligns, I think, quite nicely with what Gideon laid out. But the other is the tech dystopia of a sort of Chinese surveillance state. And so I think another, one challenge is government adoption. Another challenge is, if we're going to move down a road like that, how do we make sure that we have the right privacy laws in place? And then I guess the third thing I would maybe note is that we had a number of breakout sessions in the last convening to talk about what kinds of projects this group might want to explore going forward. And one was around government use of AI. And so we've been doing a lot at the Packard Foundation on how do you, like, we want government to adopt these technologies, because otherwise you become a dinosaur in comparison to the private sector and citizens' expectations aren't being met. But we want that adoption to be responsible. And so there are some really cool groups like Gov AI or the Center for Public Sector AI that are bringing together folks who work at public agencies to create collective bargaining power and to educate government leaders. I think now there are something like 800 agencies involved on how to adopt responsibly and how to think about good use cases. Oh, and the very last thing I would say is that I saw Suzette in here somewhere, Suzette Masters, who was doing some of this work at the Democracy Funders Network and has also been thinking just a lot about the future space. So I wanted to bring Suzette into the conversation if she has thoughts as well. But I'll stop there.
Yeah, Suzette, we have a really good contingent here of democracy space futurists. Suzette, if you'd like to share any reflections or thoughts, feel free to come off mute and I can pin you.
Well, I'm so glad you're having this program. I've watched this now 3 times, Gideon, and each time I like it better. I love the fact that you took things that are on the fringe. They're they're adopted, but they're not mainstream, and then like projected out to something that is really beyond our current way of thinking. And I just love the fact that this work is going on. I think the lack of imagination that we have right now at a time of so much disruption is really crippling. And so you need to figure out ways to get people to let go. And I think Kristen referred to this, brainstorming is one thing, but you're brainstorming from the present, right? And so you're still stuck in the mind frame of the present and the constraints of the present. And so we need these ways like Gideon speculative fiction to get us into a different headspace. And scenario work is a great way to do that. I would add one thing that Gideon did not include that I particularly love, which is intergenerational time travel, which you can do through role play that they've done a lot of in Japan to try to increase people's empathy for future generations and think about the downstream consequences of the policy decisions they make today. And so that's the kind of exercise that you could get members of Congress to do, or senior bureaucratic leaders, or members of a citizens assembly. It's a way to kind of create that notion of being a good ancestor and feel that sense. I forgot who it was that talked about how you feel responsible for the downstream effects of your actions. So anyway, I just love that you're featuring this, and I hope we can get way more people to do this kind of speculative fiction work.
Totally agreed.
Can I come back in?
Yeah, yeah.
So yeah, I just wanted to pick up on something that Kelly said, and also that Doug Edwards just said in the chat. I mean, yes, none of this works if there isn't political will. And one of the hardest questions is, how do you create political will? In other words, how do you get politicians who are very good at playing the existing system that they work in? How do you get them to see that there is a benefit in making changes to it? Whether those changes are related to uh, a new process like a citizens assembly, um, or whether they're related to technology. Yes, if we use as Doug says, if we use AI chatbots, but there isn't any attempt to prevent them being used in partisan ways, they could have harmful effects. These technologies will never fix anything in themselves. It's all about the will and the intention with which they're used. And so one of the challenges is to, as I say, persuade elected representatives that it is in their interest to have processes that make government more accountable, more responsive, give citizens more input in these ways, because it will actually make their jobs safer. Because people will feel that government is actually serving their needs better, that they have a say in it, and that they can trust it more.
Hmm. I'd love to ask each of you the same question and then open it up to questions from the group. Um, a lot of attention right now and a lot of resources right now are perhaps rightly focused on responding to a moment of crisis for our democracy. And so some of these reforms, changes that we could make to our institutions and our structures of government feel farther away than they might have 6 months or 12 months ago. And I know that folks working on, participatory budgeting, citizens assemblies are struggling to get oxygen compared to, litigation work or more responsive work. How do you think about that? How do you think about sort of the balance of these different horizons? How do you think about these sorts of scenarios in conjunction with ensuring that we have a rule of law?
Yeah, I'm happy to start and then would love others to weigh in. And I think Kristen touched on this really nicely. The goal of this project wasn't like, oh, we should all do Horizons 3 work and just hope everything else sort of works itself out at all. It was my dream was that, folks would reserve 10 or 20% of their, time, budget, thinking, energy to this longer term positive visioning work in the future. And so even we with our portfolio, this is maybe 10% of my time. Actually, arguably, Kristen, probably more, as we designed this curriculum from scratch. It hadn't really been, this methodology that we used hadn't really been done before. But there was a question in the chat about how do we balance both the sort of technocratic innovations and the cultural will to get there. And, half of our budget and time is spent on the civic culture side, mostly working with communities that are vulnerable to supporting authoritarianism and how do we bolster support for democracy in those spaces. So I guess my answer to your question would be we definitely don't want to give up on the immediate short-term work, but how do we think about rebalancing that? And there was a great example, Kristen, you might recall, of a speaker we almost brought in. I mean, we must have listened to 100 speakers as we were thinking through who to engage, who said that they set up a Google alert every week for futuring and then whatever, area they're working on or innovation and whatever area they're working on, if it's voting or, government, procurement or whatever. And then they reserve, 2 hours every Friday afternoon to just do that longer term future thinking. And I thought that was a really great example for how to operationalize this.
I love that. Suzette, Gideon, Kristen, anything you'd like to add on that front?
I would just love to riff off of something Kelly said about rebalancing. I think about this maybe the way an investor might think about this. When you have a portfolio, you don't necessarily put 100% into bonds or cash or stocks, right? Like you have a time horizon, you have different expectations for what you want. There's some risk mitigation, there's some search for some high returns. So I really think that donors really need to think about their investment and grants portfolio in a much more holistic way so that they're not inadvertently, and I would put the whole defensive portfolio in a sort of cash or bonds. So I would analogize it to that, but like that's not going to really move your portfolio very much, right? And so if you really want to transform the system that you're in, you do need some bigger bets and you do need to take some risk. And so I really think whether it's 10%, 20%, I don't know what the right allocation is, but even getting donors to think in a different way about the role of a portfolio, it really is a grants portfolio, and what the different pieces are bringing about and how they interact with each other. So I just wanted to go next because Kelly gave me an opening there.
I would add on to that, and I agree with everything that's been said. I would add on to it that one of the things that I think is most helpful and that we've heard is most helpful about this, like especially Horizon 1, 2, 3 thinking, is it does help you think about what a balanced investment portfolio looks like. And it helps you realize when you might actually be talking past someone and when you might not be talking about the same things. And so we heard a lot of people say like, oh my gosh, that framework was really unlocking for me to realize I'm in a Horizon 3 state, and most of the people that I'm talking to are in a Horizon 1 state. And that's not to say that they are wrong. It's to say that we are talking about fundamentally different things, which is why when I'm talking about imagination and the future and innovation and what's possible, and people are very entrenched in things that are harm mitigation and preservation, I think it was a good way. I mean, we see this a lot in the democracy space. What is it that we're defending? Why are we protecting it? Why are we strengthening something that hasn't worked for a lot of people for a really long time? It helps us understand the both and thinking of why some people are working in Horizon 1 or Horizon 2 and others are in Horizon 3. And so hopefully, yes, this helps funders come out with a more balanced portfolio. Hopefully, it also helps us have more nuanced conversations about where people are, why they're there, and the complementariness, if that's a word, of each of these approaches and why all of them are needed and how we can all work together a little bit better.
I love that. I see a lot of excellent questions in the chat. I'd love to turn to some of those. I also recognize that we are short on time. If this topic is something that you'd like to continue engaging with through Democracy Notes or otherwise, send an email in response to our follow-up note and we'll get that collated. I'm wondering, Liz Muehlman, if you could come off mute and share your question. Your question got a lot of love, likes, and upvotes from folks in the chat. And I'll try to pin you once you're.
Yeah, no, I'm happy to. So my question was like a lot of this imagining was focused on the formalities of government. So how do we register our opinion? How do we vote? How do we do that things? But like a lot of backsliding occurs when people lose interest in maintaining the system. So I was wondering if there's any imagining being done to like support the culture that democracy requires. So I'm thinking of like norms, so like legitimacy of the opposition or tolerance or compassion, and like being able to interact with other people and uh, view yourself in their shoes and like have their interests. So this sort of more like substantive base in addition to like making it easier for people to participate because that is super important.
Hmm. That's great. Thank you, Liz.
I might weigh in on that. So I think some of the culture of democracy has to be tied to the feeling people have that it's worth it to them, that they're seeing a measurable result. And so some of what I'm doing in the scenario is trying to imagine ways in which that is possible. And in particular, I think one of the features that I was going for here is this notion that rather than democracy having to be work that you go out and do and you have to really dedicate a lot of your time to it, it can actually be part of your daily routine. You have a daily experience of what it is to be an active citizen and also see from that the results of what you're getting from your government. So I think some of the culture, as I said, is created by people just seeing that it benefits them. Some of it, as you say, has to be about norms around respecting opposition views. One of the things that, again, I try to tilt at in the scenario is the idea that you can have community message boards, but that an AI could help you get a sense of what your community is thinking, like put you in touch with or connect you with the views and the ideas that are going on in other people's minds by giving you an easy way to summarize the conversation rather than you having to spend hours digging around on the threads. The last thing I'll say on this, though, is, and like several people in the chat asked questions about how do we make sure that AI doesn't further marginalized voices, or that it doesn't reduce human connection and those kinds of things. And those are totally fair questions because that is the way that AI has been used to a large extent up until now, because it is controlled by very powerful corporate interests that don't necessarily have much of an interest in equal access to things or in promoting civil discourse or in reducing polarization. So this comes then back to the kind of political war question. It's not, I don't any means wish to dismiss this as a trivial question. Like how do we create the environment in which society is choosing to use AI tools in a way that promotes social cohesion and democratic values rather than undermining them? I don't know how we get there, other than we have to demand it.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. That's a good answer.
Gabe, could I try just taking a pass at there were like a very quick lightning round of a bunch of the questions that I
Do
saw
it. Do it. Do
in
it.
the
That's great.
chat? Um, so the first one is just on the tech side. Part of this is technology, and I think Gideon's relied heavily on that. But I'm writing a book sort of about this right now, and I would say that is a relatively small percentage of the kinds of innovations that are out there. I mean, many of them might be tech enabled, but that is not the primary orientation of some of the futuring work. It's one part of it. So I saw a lot of questions about like, well, is it all going to be AI and what are the risks with that? But I do think that getting some kind of tech regulation to allow responsible adaptation will be really helpful. A lot of questions about inclusion of diverse voices, and we've seen really great work like Wales with their Future Commission. They engaged over the course of a number of years, something like 7,000 citizens from very diverse backgrounds to think about what they wanted the future to look like. A similar project was done in Houston, and we brought in Kristen, I'm blanking on Jerry's last name right now, but who had led that.
Hawkins.
Yeah, who had led that project. So there are, tried and true ways to bring in really diverse perspectives on this that we've learned a lot from. And then the last piece that I kept seeing come up in the chats was the question about political will and culture. And in my mind, part of that is a separate conversation. So we do a lot of work with veterans communities, faith communities, military communities, business communities on how do we support their support for democracy. And then can imagine at some point weaving those perspectives into what a future vision would look like as well. Like how do you bring in voices from rural communities and elsewhere? So I'll stop there, but that was trying to get at a couple of the questions in the chat.
We love a lightning round. So huge thank you to our ad hoc panel here. Thank you, Kelly and Gideon. Thank you, Suzette and Kristen. Um, Folks, when you exit the Zoom, there will be a one question survey. If you could fill that out, that would be much appreciated. And please do reach out either in the chat over email or in response to the follow-up message if you have questions that weren't answered, that you'd like answered, or if you have enthusiasm for continuing these sorts of conversations. Um, Thank you all, and I hope you have a great rest of your week.